everybody. So my name is Nora, part of the Honors Presents team, and today we're here to see Dr. Elizabeth Nelson. And before we get started, I'm just going to read the land acknowledgement. So we begin by acknowledging with honor and respect the indigenous nations on whose traditional territories the university now stands and whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. We also acknowledge the elders past and present, including MSU's current Council of Elders, and humbly ask for their guidance. The Valley of the Flowers has been and remains a place of learning for Native American peoples who for millennia have passed ways of knowing, being, and doing from one generation to the next. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it is an important social justice and decolonial practice that promotes indigenous visibility and a reminder that we are in settled indigenous land. And now Dr. Nelson. Thanks, Sheila.
Hello everybody, thanks for coming to class today. I know you're here because you get credit for it. Are you super excited to be here? Wow, right on. Okay, we'll have to carry that energy. So I'm a geographer, I'm in the earth sciences department. I know Nora because she took one of my classes last spring and she's been kind of watching one of the classes that I teach, but my research that I do. So this is a presentation that I've adapted from a course that I teach, which I will be teaching next spring, so a year from this semester. But I wanted to just sort of approach this idea of migrations or migrants as a category and just talk through it with all of you. So I really enjoy my life more when you all participate, but if you came to just check out and listen to a lecture, I also support that activity. So let's get going. When we think about global migration, what is it or how is it that we think about migrations? Well, migration itself is something that, we're in a classroom in America, so it's a very contentious issue, which is often how we are presented with this topic of migration as just something to think about. But it's actually something that's been going on for centuries. So sometimes the United States is described as a country of immigrants. So sometimes in my classes we talk about what types of immigration backgrounds all of my students have. For instance, I'm part Irish, part German, part Liechtensteinian. That's the part I usually brag about. But really I'm just sort of a mutt of all sorts of European ancestry, which is common in the United States. Sometimes migration is contentious and sometimes it isn't. So the class that I teach and the focus of today's lecture is about the types of migration that become difficult to conceptualize or difficult to place within global societies. Sometimes there are different driving factors, and we'll talk about push-pull factors for migration, but these are common ones that we think about. Poverty or the search for labor opportunities, conflict, persecution, natural disasters, and environmental degradation. Each of these reasons for migration has different constructs around how we either legally direct and move these flows of immigrants, or how we sort of border off or close off these types of flows of immigrants. We'll talk through those. But to help us think about the experience of an immigrant, I start with two poems. Start with two poems. One is, of course, from a Jewish immigrant. This is called the Immigrants Lament. So if we think about a couple of terms, we've got the term immigrant. Can I get a better marker maybe? We've got immigrant and emigrant. To immigrate, you're moving out of a place. You're moving into a place, and to emigrate, you're moving out of a place. So here, this is someone on the move. So immigrant, you're moving out. Welcome to my life. You're moving in. Emigrate, can I spell this correctly? You're moving out. So this is how we can use these two terms here. So here he says, I earned my bread and ate it just like you. I'm a doctor, or at least I was. The color of my hair, shape of my nose, cost me my home, my bread, and butter too. And then he talks about how it was his wife who turned him into the authorities and how he escaped and left his homeland to go live as a refugee, though we didn't necessarily have these terms when he was doing this. And then he says, when I was asked for work, it was no good. Here's something that I'm sure many of you have heard stories about, like taxi drivers that were engineers in their home countries, or they were doctors in their home countries. But when you move, your qualifications for whatever it is that your job is. So for me, it would be, is my doctoral degree recognized in the country that I would go to be a professor of some kind there? And academia is a little bit different because American institutions have a relatively global presence with sort of the certification or my degree. But not all trades would. So this is one immigrant's experience. The next story, this comes from Warsan Shire, whose parents were Somalian refugees. She was born in Kenya. Her parents had fled Somalia, so she didn't experience what she's writing about, but she writes about the experience of this sort of violent act of fleeing your home country. So you can read here that she says, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark." And so this is only part of her poem called Home, but she really depicts a visceral experience of why anyone would participate in the experience of being a refugee of any kind. Because frankly, it's difficult to leave your homeland. It's difficult to live as a foreigner or an outsider among a new host society. It's really difficult when you can take nothing with you, or when you leave under duress, which of course, in conflict, you are certainly leaving under duress. So if we think about these different overarching topics, or the umbrella parts of thinking through migration as an issue, or within context, we can think about the surrounding changes. What are the changes surrounding these drivers of immigration? And it's not just what's pushing immigrants out of a place, it's what's drawing them to another place, and it's how societies construct the framework around how we understand migration. So how many of you moved to Montana from somewhere else? How many? Okay, so almost all of us. All right, so I think it's different if you're a college student, but how long when you move to a new place before you have to get a new driver's license?
It's like a year to 6 months, depending on some states, right?
How do you know that?
Because I was originally born in Nevada. Then
Okay.
in 2008, my dad's company moved out to Southern California.
Okay.
And I remember my mom taking me and my sister to the DMV, which actually we take just the written part of the driver's test.
Yes.
And it's roughly seems to be a year to 6 months, that rough time zone about it.
And you experienced this sort of through osmosis because it was happening to your parents.
Yeah.
But it is kind of a guesswork. I actually don't know. The only reason I did it was because I was registering for classes and I wanted in-state tuition. That's why I have Montana plates. That's why I did that. Also, I didn't want Montanans to hate me. Now, I'm from Nebraska, so no one really hated me because I was like, to hate Nebraska means you have to know something about Nebraska, and no one does. So all of these experiences, like, yes, I'm making a joke about being from Nebraska because it's easier than me making a joke about being a Syrian refugee in Europe, where it's a little bit different than what's the license plate on the car that I have, or when did I have to change my registration status. So all these things come into play when we think about migration. What are the evolving political, economic, and cultural factors? So we'll talk through we're going to compare different groups of migrants today. Some migrants are politically acceptable, some aren't. Some are economically acceptable, some are culturally acceptable. And we'll do a couple of their thought exercises, frankly, about how we, just in this room, would engage with or participate in the resettlement of refugees. So to walk through some of the terms that surround this entire sort of nebulous idea of migration, frankly, migration is just people on the move. So many of us are migrants here, but we're intrastate migrants, meaning we just moved within the country that we hypothetically are in. If you're moving to Canada, you're moving to Mexico, you're moving to Europe, that's a different type of migration, which involves a whole other set of bureaucratic tasks that you would have to complete. The different types of categories of migrants include an asylum seeker, which means I'm seeking refuge somewhere from some specific, and when I say specific, I mean super articulated, direct reasons to seek and be eligible for asylum. Liminal legality means something like, I went to Europe on a student visa and I just overstayed my visa. So I arrived legally, I'm staying sort of illegally, but like I'm sort of okay. That's liminal legality. Immigrant and migrant. The term migrant, do you hear the term migrant when you read the news or engage in your life? Do you hear the term immigrant more often? Migrant, I think it's changing for your generation. My generation, when we said migrant, we meant derelict. We meant someone disobeying the law. But it's the same. It means the same thing as an immigrant. The term migrant has come to be used more often in literature. You all know we just did a land acknowledgement. We are doing things as a society to sort of diffuse some of these powerful words that have been used to oppress and marginalize different identities. So migrant and immigrant mean the same thing, but they've been used differently over time. Non-immigrants, these are just people living where they're from or where their citizenship status exists. We have refugees, which a refugee is the outcome of an asylum seeker. So an asylum seeker has not been granted asylum yet, a refugee has. Undocumented, this is similar to this notion of liminal legality, but you all have heard of undocumented immigrants. These are people that cross borders illegally and have absolutely no legal paperwork with which to reside where they are standing. So their presence alone, just their geographic taking up of space, is a crime. It's the illegal aspect of that. And then of course we have citizens. Now citizenship is an interesting body of theory in and of itself. I am a US citizen, I have a US passport. This is a really great way to prove, know, or feel your citizenship status. If you go around the world and you talk to people about identity and the passports that they hold, passports themselves become sort of a symbol or something that indicates their loyalty. Some of my work involves Algerian immigrants living in France. This is a really long story, but Algeria and France, they have a colonial relationship. So Algeria has a tenuous, at best, acceptance of French citizenship. But a French passport will get you a million more places than an Algerian passport will. So if you're Algerian, you want a French passport. Not because you identify, feel, or want to be a French citizen, but because you want access to the world. So in this case, I'm an American, I have a US passport, and I identify as an American. It's a pretty simple construct of citizenship, but it changes as you travel throughout the world, and certainly when you begin to participate in migration, your engagement with citizenship changes. So here we've got some push-pull factors, and I teach this in most of my classes. This is from a 100 level class. Push factors literally stuff that shoves somebody out of a place, and pull factors are why people move to a place. And some of these seem like really small or sort of ridiculous, like good weather is on here. You wouldn't believe how much the type of weather influences the amount of migration. It's extraordinary. It's why the Sun Belt exists. So we have physical, economic, social, and political factors where it's hard to get there, mountain climates, or there's too many hurricanes, blizzards, tornadoes, you name it. We have different economic factors. This is where an entire field of migration study comes into play. It's called labor migrations. Labor migrations, you're moving for a job. You're moving for a job because of a variety of reasons. One, there are no jobs where you're from. So a lot of my work is in Algeria. Algeria has a really limited labor market for people ages 15 to probably like 50. Why do I say 50? Because their life expectancy is a little bit different. So here I'm thinking this entire part of your life, your working age life, it's difficult for you to get a job there. So you have a lot of labor migrants going to France just to access the labor market. Now let's say that you're not from Algeria and you're not going because you need access to a labor market. Let's say you're really smart. Let's say you have a degree in finance and you work for Goldman Sachs. Where are you going to work if you work for Goldman Sachs? You're going to work in like one of three places. Do you guys know what Goldman Sachs is? Some of you are going to work for them. Heads up, it's like a 100-hour work week. You're going to work in New York, London. Where are you going to work in Asia? Where's the financial capital of Asia? Where is it?
Tokyo.
Is it in Tokyo?
Singapore.
Maybe Singapore? You're going to work in one of these places, right? So you're not moving because you couldn't get a job in America. If you're at Goldman Sachs level, you can basically get a job anywhere. But you're going to be migrating because they need to be like a hub of the really super smart people. So labor migrants is often presented as this sort of the poor, the unskilled, the uneducated, but it's not always. Labor migrations involve, I'm here in Montana as a labor migration because this is where my job was that I came for. So labor migrations are different. Social migrations, this is where we start to get into some of the relationships within society that cause people to either want or need to migrate. So here's where you start having experiences of discrimination, lack of housing. This is always a joke in Bozeman because, I mean, housing is really, it's not affordable here. So many people want to move to a place like me. So I'm on the job market now. Not because I don't like it here, I just have a short-term contract. Number one thing that I want for wherever I move, how affordable is housing? Okay, that's not true, that's number 2. Number 1 is my paycheck. Number 2 is, can I buy a house with said paycheck? So that's actually a really big one that we feel harshly here in Bozeman. Other things, political, what are the types of things that are happening within the political environment that you are living, and do they match with your life goals or your life expectations or what you want out of life? Now this is just for migrations in general. So if we think about refugees and or forced migrations, how many of these factors apply to those groups of migrants? This many, which isn't very many at all. Discrimination is kind of a tough one to sell. It's really whether or not you're persecuted that becomes important to become a refugee. Civil unrest, political unrest, all sorts of things that are happening right now. And political asylum, of course, is one reason that you can be eligible for or identified as a refugee. How big is this problem in the first place? Not very yet. It's not very big yet. On a scale of the globe, so there's 8 billion people on Earth. It's an estimate of 281 people living in a country other than their own countries. Why is it an estimate? Because the truth is, we don't actually know how many people are on Earth. We think it's about 8 billion. What's more, because that was like in November. How many people are migrating? We have no idea. We're guessing. Because you can't count people that you don't know are moving. You're only counting the people who you're clicking at the entrance of your country through the official channels of entrance, such as border crossings. So here are these stats, 1 out of every 30 people is a migrant. Now here we're talking about international migrants. So when we all moved to Montana for school or university purposes, but we were living in the United States already, that's a different type of migration. This is global migrants. Even though 281 million people isn't as big on a scale of 8 billion, it's growing. So it's grown 3 times since 1970. None of us were alive in 1970, but in the scale of human history, that's not that long ago. So to think about the escalation of the number of people on the move, this is where it starts to matter. Because, first of all, what is the demographic makeup of this population? But also, where are they going? There's only a few places that most migrants want to go. So here we've got some stats. In 2018, 52% of international migrants were male and 48% were female. So basically 50-50. This hasn't always been the case. Historically, males migrated way more than females did, but it's sort of the modern age. Women have relative equal access to migration practices. But what does this look like when we see where these migrants are going? So here I've got 2 exceptional, or these are the anomaly of population pyramids. For those of you that haven't taken a geography course, we study demography, the study of just the body of humans within a given place. So here's the United States population pyramid for 2019. This is showing us a robust, highly developed, highly industrialized nation state. Well, country, we'll call it country for today's lecture. We can see that we have a stable population growth. Population pyramids for places like Nigeria. They have a very small upper portion of the older population, and it comes out in a wide pyramid base. We have a huge, burgeoning youth population. But what's happening here? I've got 2 countries up here in the Middle East or in Southwest Asia. And what we can see here are labor migrants. So it's only in the Middle East that you will see population pyramids like this that are clearly heavily weighted to working age population. Right now, the Middle East, because of oil money, is just a hotbed of, it's just like a magnet for migrants from all over the world to come and work and send money home. So this shows up in mostly male, they're working construction jobs, but it also shows up with an increase in female. And here we can see that these women are coming to work in these countries as housekeepers, as caretakers, sort of the female domestic labor force is what this is showing us. So let's look at what do these labor migrations look like. In this case, so again, we're looking at in the Middle East or in Southwest Asia. What gets tricky here is how are migrants treated when they arrive? So these migrations, in most cases, are completely legal. So people, many cases are coming from Southeast Asia. So let's say you're coming from Nepal. So you get a visa to go. You sign up with a construction company, or you sign up to work as a housekeeper for a family in Qatar, and then they purchase your ticket for you likely, and then you go. You have a visa, remember, so you enter the country legally. Now, what often happens is your employer will take your passport, which means they've removed your ability to travel from freely or to return home. Not in every case, of course, but in many cases, they lose their passport. They, of course, have to pay back the price of their ticket. They have to sort of work for whatever the length of their contract is. So now that you have no ability to leave, you are sort of stuck or tied to this employer already. Now that where are you going to live? So there have been a lot of cases in Southwest Asia where housekeepers have been sort of locked in closets for years, by the way, for years. How are they to communicate with people back home to escape this relatively new form of indentured servitude? This becomes difficult. Construction workers are often living in storage containers, which, I mean, could you live in a storage container here in Bozeman? You'd have trouble surviving the winter. But living in a storage container in the summer in Qatar, you'd have trouble surviving without air conditioning. So they have all sorts of health problems associated with this. Now, there are also apartment complexes. I don't know that any of them have air conditioning. That seems a bit more of a luxury than are available. But you can see that not only do we have a huge influx of laborers who have left their home country, so they're like taken out of that demographic pyramid, they exist for a period of years in the Middle East, and then they travel home, hypothetically. Another type of refugee existence, or migrant existence, is the case of refugee camps. This is of one camp in particular. It's in the country of Jordan, which is by Israel. So we're still in the Middle East for this part. These are images of the Zatari refugee camp. What happens when some type of a crisis occurs? In this case, it was the Syrian civil war. When that broke out around 2010, 2011, we had this, at that time, one of the greatest refugee crises in history, in modern history. Like 6 million people are on the move. I lived in Europe during that time. I lived in France, and my sister lived in Serbia. So I'm a geographer, but I'm not a cartographer. I'm going to draw you a map of Europe. It's going to be fun. Let's do this. This is Spain. Here we go. I don't know. This is Italy. This is a boat. This is Serbia. Nice job, bud. Here we go. So my sister was living in Belgrade. I was living in Paris. This is Syria. On foot, people are leaving Syria. They are walking to Europe. Can you imagine walking to Europe? All right. So my sister would call me. She'd say, "Hey Beth, there was like a couple hundred more people in the park today. They're on the move." We weren't policing this in any way. I was just studying migration, and she was staying at home and was bored. So they kept walking. They're walking across all of Europe here. This is Germany. Now we're in France. And influxes of migrants would arrive in France, and I would know that there was new immigrants because all along the river that bisects Paris, the Seine River, pop-up camps would exist where they would have tents and they would just be existing along the river. I was also studying migrants, and migrant groups tend to be connected to one another. So a lot of people that I worked with were taking food and supplies to these Syrian refugees that were staying near the river. So in this case, a lot of Syrian refugees flooded into neighboring Jordan, and they set up a refugee camp for them. Just by the nature of what I called it, a refugee camp, it's meant to be temporary. Meaning, thank you Syria for your civil war, but maybe in a few years I'd like you to go home. What's the status of the Syrian civil war today?
Still ongoing.
It's still going. So when's it going to end? By the end of the year, maybe?
I think it's just getting worse.
Maybe? Maybe? Okay, so now we're like, oh, well, we didn't plan for you to be here for 90 years. What are we supposed to do with this? Zatari itself has become a city. It's become a permanent city. It is walled off with it feels like a border of a country. You can't freely move to and from it. Syrians in this camp cannot leave and go work in Jordan. You have to have special paperwork for that. So in this case, this becomes sort of a de facto country of sorts that's just sort of suspended above time, space, and all the laws that apply to anybody. When I had some classmates that were doing research in Jordan, you can't go here, and in fairness, you shouldn't, because for me to have gone and visited the Zatari refugee camp would have been similar to me going to a zoo, to just look at animals in cages, right? So to go here to just look at human suffering on a large scale is a cruel engagement of an experience. We shouldn't do it. But there is a freeway that crisscrosses through the Za'atari refugee camp. So we drove on this freeway, we got out of the car. This was in 2016. I got out of the car, and you look to the left of the freeway, and it is white tents as far as you can see until the earth curves. And you look this way, and it is white tents as far as you can see until the earth curves. This is how big Za'atari is. It is absolutely massive. And they're here with absolutely zero plans for how to progress this particular camp, which is one of the more famous camps in the world, to anything besides what it is today. Another type of migrant is a climate migrant. So now we're changing our geographic location. We're going to an island country called Tuvalu. So here we can orient ourselves to Australia, and north here in the Pacific Ocean, you can see the island of Tuvalu. It's like 6 feet above water. Okay, that's its sort of its highest elevation. Climate change is happening, sea level is rising. The amount of land that they have is getting smaller because the sea is rising. So here's the exercise. This is how I do it in my classes. There's maybe 10,000 Tuvalans. They'd like to migrate together. So where's a good place to send a bunch of Tuvalans? I'll go first. Let's send them to Wyoming. It's not that densely populated. We got lots of space in Wyoming. They'll be fine, right? What could go wrong? Do they speak English? Do they have any idea how to feed themselves on an open prairie like what exists in Wyoming? How would they continue their cultural practices? But and then the real question is, does any of that matter? Does it matter does anyone know anything about Tuvalan culture? You ever heard of Tuvalu? So does it matter? Does it matter if they get to keep their language, their cultural traditions, their familial structures? They're really good at making fishing nets. That makes sense. They eat a lot of fish. So where people go really matters. It wasn't Tuvalu, but it was another Pacific nation that applied to Australia for refugee status for their entire population. Because this notion of keeping cultural groups together matters to the cultural group of which is about to experience displacement. So they applied to Australia and said, please let us come to your shores and we'll live our lives. It's kind of similar. We can live our lives as Tuvalans here. It wasn't Tuvalu, it was another nation state. Australia said, heck no, get out of here. Australia's terrible. They used to have a migration policy called the White Australia Policy. That wasn't this long ago, by the way. Guess who they wanted? Guess who they wanted to migrate to Australia? A very specific kind of migrant. So here's where we start getting into tricky sort of turns of phrases of who is and who is not desired as a migrant to some places. So here's where it gets really, this just sucks for Tuvalu. Environmental degradation is not legally understood to be a purpose to claim asylum anywhere. Sort of like, good luck, hope it goes well for you all. I'm not going to help. That is what's happening globally for climate migrants at this time. So now let's dig a little deeper into these ideas of desirable versus undesirable migrants. And this isn't a term that I made up. This is from France. Are any of you French? I usually ask permission before I make fun of the French. We're in an American classroom. We make fun of the French all the time. And in fairness, they do the same. So the French, they had a really racist president, if anyone's surprised. Nicolas Sarkozy was his name. He actually went to jail, or I don't know that he actually went to jail, but he did get convicted of some criminal charges, maybe money laundering, I don't know. So Sarkozy says, we would like to pick our migrants. We don't want undesirables. How do you spell E-A? Tell me what you think. This isn't your opinion. What does Nicolas Sarkozy think is an undesirable migrant? Go. Poor, definitely. Disabled. They're tough to take care of.
People of color?
Yes.
Elderly children.
Oh, yeah, definitely. None of those vulnerable populations.
Unable to work in any way.
Ooh! Labor lacking is what we're going to call that. Is that what you meant?
Yeah.
Muslims was this was what he was targeting. Actually, he was targeting these. and this. Because in France, they have a really big social safety net. This was his argument. I'm not telling you this is right or wrong. So if you arrive in France, and also, by the way, I use France a lot as a cover for when I'm actually talking about America. So in France, they have like welfare, unemployment, and Nicolas Sarkozy didn't want to give that money to these people, but also he didn't want to have terrorists come into the country. Because all Muslims are terrorists, right? Right, of course not. This is ridiculous, Nicolas Sarkozy. So here we've got two types of migrants. We've got Syrian refugees, and we have Ukrainian refugees. So the Syrian refugee crisis involved like 6.6 million Assyrians, which at the time was an insanity level of migration. Absolute insanity. Never, unprecedented. Then of course last spring happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. Now we've got 8 million, 2 million more refugees on the run. But in addition to refugees, you have to know the term IDP, or internally displaced persons, meaning they didn't leave Ukraine, or they didn't leave Syria, but they're still uprooted from their homes. So we calculate all of these together, and we've got 12 million Syrians are displaced. We've got 8 plus, well, 6-ish, what does that equal, 14? I'm not a mathematician. We've got 14 million displaced Ukrainians. These are people on the move, going somewhere, needing things. So, Europe really did not want Syrian refugees because of all these reasons why Nicolas Sarkozy doesn't want them. But Ukrainian refugees, why are they okay? Actually, they were on the move physically. They're white, they're Christian. This they did have a lot of, but we appealed to like bleeding hearts of the world, so that one kind of got flip-flopped. And are they labor lacking or not? Some were and some weren't, but we flipped it to have women and children be bleeding heart of the world. So do you guys remember all the images we saw in the news of like, welcome to Poland, here's like a teddy bear and a lollipop. Isn't this amazing how we're welcoming these Ukrainian refugees? When literally, when my sister and I were watching Syrians walk to Europe, people would turn away. People weren't giving them teddy bears and lollipops. So why is one group wholesale rejected and one group is wholesale accepted? The success factor of those 8 million Ukrainian refugees is off the charts. I will say this with confidence. The Ukrainian refugee crisis is the single most successful refugee crisis we've ever had in the world. Kind of a weird sentence to say, but we did a great job. They're welcome everywhere. In fact, in most of my classes, in one of my classes, a young woman and her family had applied to accept Ukrainian refugees in their home in Bozeman, Montana. Yeah.
Does that also have something to do, not to say that those reasons don't apply, but does that also have to do with the fact that there's kind of this like solidarity against Russia?
Why do we not have a solidarity against Russia or Syria? Yes, it does. This is great. Thank you. Good job. This is going to get real tricky. I'm just going to go to the next slide. So I was going to ask you how many of you would take in a Ukrainian refugee? So how many of you would, for reals? Would you take in a Ukrainian refugee? I hate roommates, so I don't really want one, but like I probably should. Okay? Yeah? Maybe? How many of you would take in a Russian refugee? Because there are many. You would? My sister, the Serbian example here today, she says yes. You are the third person of everyone I've asked, maybe 100 people. So Russian, yes. Aren't you worried?
Well, the 101 slide you put up with push and pull, I mean, there are going to be those reasons they left. They're not going to leave unless they're being persecuted.
Don't you know that there are Russian spies everywhere? If you were going to like go undercover, being a refugee would be a great idea. Sorry, this is actually what my students say. Because what happened, I have a student this is a longer story, his aunt works at an aid organization in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is below Russia, and she called him, he was taking my migrations class, and she said, we have hundreds of Russians streaming across the border into Kazakhstan, trying to escape being conscripted into the Russian army. So we have hundreds, maybe thousands. I searched for a while. Nobody knows how many Russians are fleeing Russia, but this gets tricky because how could we, as patriotic Americans with our distrust of Russia, how could we house them? That gets tricky. I really admire that you said yes. It's hard for me to imagine housing a Russian. Every Russian I've ever met, and I've traveled in Russia for a period of time, I liked every single one of them. I've never met a Russian I didn't like. So what is it? What is it about how we as people experiencing life on an American university, how are we internalizing messages about Russians?
Social media.
Social media. Let's just say media in general, right? Which is the same reason that French, or let's just say Europeans, were being fed information about Syrians, about Muslims, all of this. So this is not a presentation on the pros and cons or social ills of social media and our presence in our lives. It's here, it exists, and it's how we function with a lot of things. But this question of how is it that we, just as regular everyday humans, if we take ourselves out of, we're all just here to get credit for this lecture that this weird woman from the geography department is giving today, but like ask ourselves, would I take a Ukrainian, a Syrian, a Russian into my home on an unknown period of time basis? Because as we know, refugee status can be a protracted situation. So what are the different types of desirabilities across the board? So we're leaving these two examples, and we're going to this example. This is some of my favorite literature. What do we know about Tibetans? What do you know about them? I've listed some things. They're enlightened. They meditate all the time. They're Buddhists. They are peaceful. They're beneficial. Look how happy they are. We love Tibetan migrants. This is actually true. We as Americans love Tibetan migrants. Let's take them all. Who are we sort of flipping off when we accept Tibetan migrants?
China.
China.
That's good.
Another reason why Ukrainian refugees, as you said, are so appealing to the world is because we're mad at Russia. Like, well, Russia, we're going to take Ukrainians. Here, when we take Tibetans, which was occupied by China since 1959, we're saying, screw you, China, we're going to take these Tibetans. Plus, look how great they are. We love them. They're adding all kinds of diversity and happiness to our society and culture. Okay, the bottom picture is of Vietnamese migrants, which have been called boat people over time and history. Less so here in the United States because it's harder to get here on a boat than it is to other places in Europe, where when the Vietnam War was first beginning and then sort of going on, migrants would just get in boats and they would leave and they sort of would arrive at whatever shores they arrived on. So when we look at people from a relatively similar part of the world, well, they have different religious expressions, but this notion of boat people is that they come as an entirely different body of adjectives than Tibetan migrants. So there's some of the literature that I've studied about Tibetan migrants. One piece in particular that I'm thinking of gave an example of a second generation Tibetan. So his parents came over, he was born in California. He was adopting like a black identity, where he listened to rap music, wore clothes that were associated with a black culture, and he was rejecting his Tibetan identity. He suffered from depression, which, by the way, depression happens. It's not because he's Tibetan or he's in California. It's because when you leave your home and cannot return, a lot of mental illness starts to occur. Feelings of homesickness, which I imagine I feel it, many of you might feel it sometimes. But imagine it in a way that you could never return home. It's gone forever. And it's not 2 or 3 states away, it's 2 or 3 worlds away. It may as well be on the moon for as often as you're gonna get home to it. So we have this way of the expectations we have of this type of migrant and how that becomes a struggle for 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th generations, who, by the way, they just want to be American. They don't want to be Tibetan American, not all of them, some of them might. So we have other types of workers, or that's not even, that's an accident, I shouldn't predict. We have other types of people. We have other types of humans arriving in a moment of desperation, sort of requesting refuge or help or assistance. But who you are and where you come from really matters. So all of these things are just to sort of show you that we as a world, as a global community, have shifted how we think about, feel, and engage with migrants, and certainly with refugees. So here's a quote where refugees, they've existed through all of time in history, but the notion of a legal definition of a refugee came after World War II. We had a whole bunch of Jews that had been persecuted, genocide happened, you all remember. So World War II, everybody is super tired of killing one another. They're tired of their sons dying, they're tired of going to war, they're tired of being at war, everybody wants peace, and everybody feels really bad about what happened to Jews. So refugee was great. We have all kinds of laws created about this, structures put in place for the replacement, resettlement of populations that have been uprooted. You come through time in history and we don't remember World War II. We weren't there. Our parents and grandparents might, but it gets farther and farther away where it's sort of like we also don't remember the Revolutionary War and it doesn't really play a part in our everyday lives. So you start to lose the sentiments that came along with the development of these ideas. So, what's the plan? Cuban refugees, we love Cuban refugees, why? Because what?
Piss off China.
Well, China, yeah. Okay, so let's just say communists. So we love Cuban refugees because we hate communists. I'm sorry, I'm not saying this as I do or you should, but just as America. At that time, and we didn't like Castro, who had aligned himself with China, all sorts of other communist countries, Russia will fit here. So there's a lot of politics involved in the types of refugees that we like. This is, I guess, the point of this slide. So what's the plan for refugees? What do you guys think the plan is? I presented you with political reasons, environmental reasons. Maybe you need a little more information. By 2050, it is predicted that there will be 2 billion climate migrants. What's the plan?
SpaceX.
Where? SpaceX! Actually, that's a great answer. Cool. Nice shot. That's it. That was the end of the lecture. SpaceX. Right. We'll send them to space. No, I think that we will send the rich people to space, and the migrants can stay wherever they leave behind. So that we don't have a plan is really it. Maybe SpaceX is the plan. So if we think about the 4 root causes of refugee flows, we've talked about political instability, economic tensions. This makes sense. Ethnic conflict. Right now, today, Sudan has a civil war going on. Does Ethiopia have a civil war going on? Is it called a civil war?
I think it just kind of ended.
Oh, so they're fine. They're probably totally fine. Okay. Sudan for sure is having a problem. And by the way, like in South Sudan, it's not much better. So, all right. But that's a political or ethnic conflict. This notion of environmental degradation, because it is not included in the legal construct with which to guide and direct refugee flows, they aren't refugees. There is no plan for this. And also, this idea of our sentiments towards this word refugee, I don't know how you felt about it before you arrived at today's lecture. The world is starting to, this has become, give me some synonyms with refugee. Do you guys ever think about it? Maybe you don't think about it. I mean, I think about it all the time, but that's my problem. Okay, so refugees, they start to become burdensome. I don't know if I'm spelling that right. And we had a time when, well, the economy's going to be crashing soon. We can't take on more people that are going to be burdens to our social safety net. So how is it that we come to think about providing refuge to people that have their homes swallowed up by fill in the blank of environmental degradation? So we need to change the definition of a refugee, which today it is any individual who, owing to a well-grounded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside of his country of nationality, or is unable, or owing to such fear, unwilling to avail himself to the protection of that country. So what is a well-grounded fear mathematically that you can prove is true every time? You can't. You have to take somebody's word for it. So if you don't want them because they've become burdensome, you're going to say, yeah, okay. Is it really that bad, or are you probably really fine back where you came from? What is a social group? Do you know how many countries it is illegal and or punishable by death to be a homosexual? But it didn't say sexual orientation, it just said social group. So how can we differentiate who is and who is not experiencing a well-grounded fear with which they cannot or will not avail themselves to their country of origin? So this is where lawyers serve a purpose in this world, but the language gets tricky, murky, and is often used as a tool to unqualified people, which is why qualifying for asylum often involves the necessity to have some provable illness. So, for example, this is true. There are some groups of legal aid lawyers that sort of celebrate when an immigrant gets diagnosed with cancer, because that is like the lottery ticket to get into another country to access medical care. Can you imagine that you are celebrating some diagnosis of a difficult disease so that you can access what is relatively sort of guaranteed to you in the first place? And of course, already you know, climate's not included in any of these. Here are two images. The top one is from Tuvalu that we already visited. I know that seems kind of comical. Frankly, I have to admire Pacific Islanders for their ability to face what is clearly an impossible situation with comedy in some cases. This is from the Maldives, where we have officials doing a meeting underwater to illustrate that this is where all of Maldives will be in the not too distant future. So there are groups of people that are sort of lobbying the world's sentiment to get on their side. What do you think the entire population of all the islands in the Pacific equals? Is it
Probably still south of 1 million.
Right, it's still not that many. So even if every single person in the entire world of, they're called small island developing nations, if they all got together, so it's not just the Pacific, the Caribbean, and sort of lobbied the world, it's still not that many people. But if it's not that many people, why can't Australia take them, right? But Australia itself is undergoing its own sort of climate pressures because most of Australia's desert, which is just going to get more deserty in the coming years, and a lot of their population centers are on the coasts, which are just going to undergo sea level change. So Wyoming is the right answer, by the way. The end of all of this. It's not really, but indeed, we here in Montana are experiencing parts of climate migrations. Now, what's happening in Montana is a confluence of events, one of which is climate migrations. You have people escaping densely packed cities. The pandemic accelerated all of these things. So what we will see in the coming decades, your lifetimes, your children and grandchildren's lifetimes, is that the whole world's on the move. I think it's going to be a free-for-all. I'm a migration scholar. This is all I think about all the time, so maybe I'm a little biased in my thoughts. But this way of thinking about what are we to do, it includes Montanans. Quick pitch for my work. My work is in Algeria, which is a country in North Africa. It's the largest country in North Africa by area. Most of it is the Sahara Desert. So they actually, 90% of the population lives on 5% of the land in the northern part in the Mediterranean climate. What will happen by 2050 is an increase of about 2 degrees Celsius, which is, it's past the climate goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. This is just in Algeria, which will equate to a decrease of water resources, which are already limited, and increasing desertification, meaning the Sahara Desert is growing, and it is. Declining agricultural yields, which is going to equal almost zero. The arable land in Algeria, while very arable, is very small. And planning challenges in energy consumption. Algeria is different though, because they actually have huge oil and gas reserves, which I know, they contribute to climate change, but it's already burning anyway, so we're just going to go and mine all this oil and gas, sell it to Europe, because guess what's happening in Europe? They're having an energy crisis because Russia invaded Ukraine. So the story all comes back together, where we've got Algeria, who's just been kind of hanging out in its post-colonial existence like, we've got some energy to develop, but nobody wants it because we're friends with Russia. We are part of this sort of Eastern alliance. But then when Russia invades Ukraine and all of Europe is ringing the phone, like, Algeria, we need your oil and gas. And Algeria's like, whoa. Okay, I've got an idea. Russia, don't be mad. What if we sell all of these carbon fuels to Europe, but we in Algeria, we've got tons of solar resource because most of our country's in a desert. Algeria's plan is to develop renewable energy for domestic energy consumption, which by the way is a great idea, period, 100%. But they're gonna develop and extract their carbon fuels to sell that to Europe for the highest dollar. Which, I'm just gonna be a capitalist only in this moment, is a great idea.
Just passing off the problems to someone else.
That is correct, yes.
What happened with last winter with the mild winter in Europe? How did Algeria do with that?
So Europe today, okay, when the Ukraine conflict began, you all remember, Europe was freaking out with good reason. They have refilled their gas storage, natural gas. They're like good to go right now for a few years, but they don't have a plan for the next 20, 30, 40 years. So Italy, who did not colonize Algeria, they did colonize Tunisia, which is right next door, but that's another story. So Algeria's like, we're not gonna give this to France, but Italy, we'll take you, we'll like entertain this. Italy would like to import almost all of Algeria's fuel to become an energy exporter to all of Europe. So that it's not Italy's energy that they're selling, but they're gonna buy it at wholesale prices from Algeria, and then everyone's gonna be calling Italy then for the deployment of that. Europe also, for better for worse, they accelerated a renewable energy transition because they had to. So I teach an energy class, which you should all also take. But the energy class was happening while the Ukraine conflict happened last spring. We were literally talking about energy transition. You know how energy transitions happen? They happen because they have to. Everyone in this room knows that we should be doing it because it's the right thing to do. But we're not doing it because it costs too much money, and we just don't have to right now. But when Ukraine happened, Europe had to accelerate the transition and continue in a different direction. Did that answer your question, maybe a roundabout or too much information of a way?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So anyway, sorry, last couple of slides. This is my energy, this is the energy trajectory. This is my research trajectory, where I'm looking at the confluence of these factors in the context of Algeria. Why Algeria? One, that's where I was already. But two, because Algeria is like a magnifying glass, what's happening to the rest of the world. We've got increasing climate problems. We have political instability, which is a tricky subject, but they have energy development. But they also have mostly desert. And they also have a population that's been on the move already anyway. So what's happening in Algeria is what's likely going to be indicative of what's happening in the rest of the world with terms of migration. So, last slide, pitch for my class next spring. It's called the Geography of Refugees and Forced Migrations. It's a special topics class. You can email me to get information about it, but I would love to have you guys come take that class with me. And I'd love to have some questions. We have 5 minutes before you have to leave, but we get credit for 5 minutes. Let's have some questions or discussion. Or who wants to take a Russian refugee? Or a Tuvalan? Somebody has a question or a comment, or an idea or a thought? Yeah.
This might be like way too big of a concept.
Let's do it.
But like, where does like the brain drain fit in all this?
Brain drain gets tricky with other influencing factors. So the brain drain, you all know, is like smart people leave, right? Smart people are leaving to access opportunities. So instead of doing a global story, I'll just do my hometown of Nebraska. Anybody want to move to Nebraska? Any takers? No? Why don't you want to move to Nebraska?
It's like Iowa, but just slightly bigger.
In fairness to Iowans, they do grow more corn than we do, but don't tell anybody I told you that. Okay, so in Kearney, Nebraska, we have a hospital and a university. But other than that, there's nothing to do in Kearney. So anybody who wants to do anything with their lives besides these two things, you leave and you go to bigger cities. Why are people coming to Bozeman? Bozeman's an interesting one. Come on. Everybody wants to be outside. What else?
University.
We have a hospital. It's not as big of a deal. I think Billings is bigger. What are
Mountains.
what is it?
Mountains.
Mountains. Plus, it's the cool thing. Everybody's doing it, right? It is. Really, that actually, social media comes back into play here. Not a direct, like I can't blame Instagram for this, but we kind of can. When we think about the people coming to Bozeman, all of these things need laborers. Laborers don't count as part of the brain drain because they don't have that higher level of educational attainment. The country of Ireland has specific brain attraction labor laws where you have to have X degree in X sector, like computer science was a big one that they were attracting migrants for a long time, which means that places like Algeria, I mean, everybody leaves. But let's use Algeria. I'm drawn. You might have noticed I'm a bit dramatic. This is not entirely true, but it's not entirely untrue. There's basically like one visa to America every year in Algeria. It's given on a lottery basis. Every Algerian I know has their name in the visa lottery to come to America. I'm part of the Facebook group of people, recipients of these lottery visas to come to America. It's based on your educational attainment. The tricky thing about Algeria is that they have a lot of people with higher education, but they have a higher level of unemployment the higher your education is, because there are no jobs for you in Algeria with this high education. You got this in the hopes that you win that lottery, whether it's to the US, France and Algeria have weird relations, and it changes how many visas they allow every year. A few hundred to a few thousand every year, it changes, but your education is often your ticket out. Does that give
that's
something?
interesting.
Yeah.
So is the lottery not really a lottery then?
The lottery's a lottery if you, they have like a checklist, so you just have to go through it. If you satisfy these 10 things, your name is put into a bucket with a few million other people, and every year. I'm a bit of a cynic, so I can't believe that they put a hand in a bucket and pull out a name. I'm sure that...
I feel like it's a little too old school.
And Algeria is one of many places that has lotteries like that, but in fairness, and not because I think America is an incredible place to just, by birth, the serendipitous location of your birth to be here, or to be here on a student visa, or however it is that we are all in this classroom, legally or not. So to know that everyone on earth, I don't know if that's true, a huge number of people want to go to the United States, which is by far the #1 migrant destination on earth, Europe as a region, then it starts to get down to trickier scales of whatever. You need to have a robust labor market. You have to have an enjoyable lifestyle. And frankly, some of those push or pull factors, like Hollywood, is one of the largest influencers of why anybody wants to come to America in the first place. It's because they think it's all Hollywood or New York City, where they have these romanticized ideals of what life in America is like. Which, by the way, that life is actually, it's not even available to every American. That life is available to some people on a scale that's different than what I think the rest of the world thinks of. All right, thanks guys, I appreciate your attention today.
If any of you guys can get signed in, you can totally come